Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. Today we're going to be looking at the Changeling phenomenon, an odd and creepy bit of fairy lore that seems to be largely ignored today. I know some of you are more interested in the true crime type videos on this channel, but I think you'll like this one as well. The belief in fairies, whether it's real or not, did inspire some truly gruesome events in history, and I'm going to be covering some of these in the video. The Changeling is most often associated with fairies in folklore, but it's also historically been attributed to witches and Satan. It really depends on the culture and the religious belief of the times. But the story is almost always the same. A person, usually a newborn baby, is swapped with an identical copy. In some rare cases there are stories of adults being swapped, but most often it's a baby. The real baby is taken away for some nefarious purpose, and the parents are left raising a sinister duplicate that will cause untold misfortunes for the family. In some stories, the child is replaced by a lump of wood or wax that resembles the child at first, but soon turns into its original form once it's too late for the parents to retrieve the child. Belief in changelings emerged in the Middle Ages, but carried right through into the 20th century. Often the parents felt that they were to blame for the changeling. It was believed that the fairies would visit unhappy or immoral households and swap the children that were not being watched carefully enough. Mothers were expected to watch over their sleeping babies vigilantly in order to prevent the fairies from stealing their children. This created an unsettling background of dread for any new parents. Anytime they fell asleep, they might wake up wondering if the child in the cot was still actually theirs. One common solution was to hang an iron poker or a pair of scissors above the cot, due to the belief that fairies were naturally afraid of iron and wouldn't go near it. There was also the idea of a child becoming fairy-struck. This was like a mysterious fey illness that a child would develop. The change would be more gradual, rather than a sudden swap. More and more of the child's soul would be taken away by the fairies over a course of a few months. It's more like a fairy possession. But either way, the result was always the same. The child was not who they once were, and although they looked exactly the same, they didn't belong to the parents anymore. Once swapped for a changeling, their parents would notice strange changes in their child's behaviour. Changelings had a bad temperament, crying constantly and always seeming hungry. There were stories of babies that would drink gallons and gallons of milk and never be satisfied. The changelings would always look exactly like the missing child, but they would develop strange deformities over time. Most common reports were of a child's skin becoming shriveled and discoloured, or fur growing on parts of the body, and the child would always remain the same size, refusing to grow. This would cause a lot of sickly children to be misdiagnosed as changelings, and then they wouldn't receive the treatment that they actually needed. But even without the physical or behavioural changes, there was the idea that the parents would just know that the child wasn't theirs. Some sort of parental bond that was felt before would suddenly be gone. The child wasn't their own and they just knew it. And once a changeling was identified, that's when things got really dark. There were various methods for getting a changeling to identify itself, and most of these involved some sort of painful abuse. One common treatment in the 15th century was to give the child a bath in water that had been boiled with foxgloves. The flowers were thought to repel changelings, but as foxgloves are poisonous to humans, bathing a baby in this concoction would often result in an infant's death. In these cases, it would probably have been assumed that the child's death was a sign of it being a changeling and that the real child would be returned soon afterwards. However, the history book seems suspiciously absent of any reports of a child being returned after a changeling's death. In 1850, in Ross Cray, Ireland, parents of a 6-year-old Mary Ann Kelly were distraught to find that their sickly child was not recovering despite doctors' best efforts. She was paralysed and wasn't gaining any weight. She seemed to be getting weaker by the day. In a desperate attempt to find a cure to her mystery illness, they visited a fairy doctor named Bridget Peters. Bridget said that Mary Ann was fairy-struck, and that if they wanted to save their child, they would need to follow her instructions carefully. Mary was given a medicine made from foxglove, verbena and milk. Although this was highly toxic, it must not have been strong enough to kill her outright. She just became more sick. It was a sure sign that the medicine was working and that fairy magic was at play. This only encouraged them to continue with the procedure. The next stage of the treatment was to lie little Mary Ann naked on an iron shovel and leave her outside in the freezing cold air overnight. A mother would sit inside by the back door, listening to her child's tortured crying, all the time repeating the phrase, "Mary Ann, if you are able to come in, please do so." Her belief was that once the fairy spirit had left her child, she'd be able to walk and would return to the house naturally. Of course, this didn't work. On the second day, more medicine was administered, and she was given the same freezing treatment overnight, and again on the third day, and on the fourth, and so on. Somehow, this sickly child endured 6 nights of this before dying. Her cause of death was identified as foxglove poisoning and hypothermia. In 1863, in New York, Mary Nell was told by a friend that fairies had been spotted in her apartment. This led her to believe that her 3-year-old child had been abducted by fairy folk and replaced with a changeling. The prescribed treatment at that time was simple. The child would be made to sit on a red-hot shovel blade. If it was a fairy, it would fly away and the real child would be returned. So one day, whilst her husband was at work and without his knowledge, she brought an iron shovel into the house and heated it in the fireplace. Once it was glowing red, she stripped her 3-year-old child and forced them on top of the shovel blade. Of course, the child didn't fly away, but just writhed around in agony atop the scalding metal. The resulting burns were so severe that the child died a week later. But in both these cases I've mentioned, the resulting deaths were mercifully quick compared to the ordeals that some children went through. In many cases, when the changeling refused to leave and the child remained alive, the abuse would continue indefinitely. One case was that of Walter Trevelyan of Penzance, England. Although he died at the age of 2 in 1843, his short life had been one of almost constant suffering. Thought to have been swapped for a changeling as a baby, he was tortured on a daily basis. He would be starved for days on end. In the winter he was tied up in a tree so that he would be exposed to the freezing winds. He would be forced to lie face down on gravel for long periods of time. On a number of occasions they would hang him upside down till his face turned purple and he lost consciousness. At night they made him sleep on a mattress filled with corks. This uneven surface was made purposefully uncomfortable so that he couldn't find an end to his torments even at night. It's hard to believe that parents would willfully subject a child to such treatments. It really is testament to how strong the belief in fairies was in some people and how much they feared them. A lot of the punishments are reminiscent of witch trials. There seems to be very little way for the child to convince a parent that they are not in fact a changeling. Any protests are seen as further evidence of the changeling's evil ways. Often death is the only way for the child to escape the punishment. One method for uncovering a changeling is described in a Scottish book on folklore from 1881. A basket is placed above a roaring fire, suspended from the branch of a hazel tree. The suspected changeling is placed into the basket. If the child screams, then that's sure evidence that they are a changeling, and then those present have to quickly run to the child and hold them firmly in place above the fire. Once the ordeal is over, the changeling's body is taken to a crossroads, where it was believed that the body would be taken away and the real child would be returned to them. And this is only a small sample of the abuses carried out in the name of banishing a changeling. Other methods include half drowning a child in a bathtub full of urine. Another is placing them alive in a hot oven. They could also have a hot poker forced into their mouth or simply be beaten to the point of near death. In the parents' eyes, they were simply carrying out the abuses on an inhuman creature and they felt justified in what they were doing. The most recent changeling case I can find happened in 1895 in Ireland, and the victim was a 26-year-old woman. Bridget Cleary had been happily married to Michael Cleary for 8 years, but in 1895 that all changed. Bridget had become ill with bronchitis and showed no sign of recovering. Her condition became so bad that a priest was called in to perform last rites. However, her husband was highly superstitious. The house where they lived was rumoured to be built on a fairy mound, and soon he began to suspect that her illness could be the result of fey magic. He accused Bridget of being a changeling. His convictions were so strong that he managed to convince his own children and neighbours, and they started to believe it too. One night, in an attempt to bring the real Bridget back, Michael and his children and neighbours gathered at the house and subjected Bridget to a string of abuses. Along with a series of beatings, she was doused with urine and held over a burning fire. Towards the end of the ordeal, Michael held a burning lump of wood to his wife's mouth and told her to say her real changeling name 3 times. When she refused, he poured lamp oil all over her body and set her alight. Of course, Bridget died of her injuries soon after that. In most of these cases, the people involved were arrested and imprisoned for murder, which shows that although the belief in the supernatural was strong among common people, it wasn't so readily recognised in the eyes of the law. Most changeling cases can be explained away quite easily today. A lot of them were undiagnosed mental or physical illnesses in the children, combined with the desperation of a superstitious parent to bring them back to health. Instead of accepting that their child had an incurable illness, they resorted to methods that just seem crazy today. There's also forms of mental illness that we recognise today, such as Capgras syndrome. It's a paranoid delusion where a sufferer believes that loved ones have been replaced with a copy. In modern times though, fairies don't often get the blame, but belief that babies are stolen or possessed with a duplicate still exists in one form or another. A common case that still happens on a frighteningly regular basis is the belief that the child is possessed by demons, and in the process of exorcising these spirits, they get subjected to similar barbaric abuses as the changelings did in the past. There's also stories of alien abductions that are extremely similar to past stories of fairy abduction. In some cases, the baby is swapped whilst it's still in the mother's womb. New Age beliefs in things such as star seeds and indigo children can be seen as retellings of the same ancient changeling folklore. Although these stories might evolve over time, the core belief that a person can be replaced or possessed by a creature from another world is common across almost all cultures. There have been some good modern day depictions of the changeling story. Most of them don't deal with the paranormal at all, but the core idea is always the same. One I can recommend is a film called We Need to Talk About Kevin. It's adapted from a book, but I haven't read the book, so I can only recommend the film really. It doesn't contain any supernatural elements whatsoever. It deals purely in the psychological tension between a mother and her son. There's a real sense of horror as the mother slowly becomes convinced that her son is a sociopath, and that her own behaviour towards him might have contributed to his developmental issues. As I say, it doesn't have any paranormal element whatsoever. There's no sense that the son was ever swapped with some fairy creature or anything like that, but it's a changeling story in every other sense. If you want a good understanding of some of the psychological issues surrounding a lot of these changeling cases, then I definitely recommend this movie. Another movie which I can recommend is almost like an inversion of the classic changeling story. It's called Goodnight Mommy, and the premise is that the mother of 2 boys goes away for some kind of facial surgery and returns with her face covered in bandages. Her personality seems slightly changed, I guess, from the strain of the surgery and her life, and the boys become convinced that their mother has been replaced with a copy, and that once she removes her bandages they'll see that it's not her underneath. It's a classic changeling story, but it's almost like it's been inverted. And similar to We Need to Talk About Kevin, it doesn't really have any proper paranormal element to it. It's purely about the psychology of the situation. There's also a movie actually called The Changeling. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with fairy folklore. It mostly revolves around a real-life murder case and a woman's missing child being replaced by a stranger. I just find it interesting that these 3 modern retellings of the Changeling story contain all the classic elements, but the paranormal side of it has been completely removed. And then there's movies like Rosemary's Baby and Grace, which are basically a changeling story but with a more satanic element to it. I find the persistence of folklore into modern culture quite an interesting subject. These stories always seem to stay the same, but as our understanding of the world increases, the superstitious elements seem to dwindle. But even so, who's to say the superstitions of the past didn't have some element of truth to them? An alarming number of children do go missing in woodlands and forests each year, and who's to say that in some of these cases the fairy folk didn't take them? And the ones who come back, how do we know that they're the same children that went away in the first place? Maybe there is something in it after all. So thank you for watching this episode. Hopefully it's had a good mix of worldly crimes mixed with otherworldly folklore. If you enjoyed, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to, please check out the merchandise store. All the artwork on there is drawn by me, so not only do you get to support the channel, but you also show yourself to be a connoisseur of high quality artwork. Oh, and also subscribe if you're not already, and follow me on Instagram, and join the Discord server, and check out my second channel, and check out my gaming channel, and check out my testicles. Until next time, goodbye.